I was never much of a comics kid back in the day. The only ones I ever read were my father's old G.I. Joe issues.
Oh shit! Get the fuck out of here!
I have, however, been able to appreciate many of them in retrospect. At least the good ones. The games based on comics, though, I've always enjoyed those. I was on the hype train for Arkham Asylum and had played Spider-Man 2 on the GameCube before that. They're pretty comparable, Batman and Spider-Man. Heroes based on animals with a more grounded network of plots and antagonists. As it turns out, though, their games are miles apart when it comes to their quality. Not for lack of trying, of course. The Arkham series and Insomniac Spider-Man titles are both at their core intended to recreate for the astute player a true and honest feeling of being the hero. The difference, then, is one's ability to elicit that feeling while the other's hyperfixation on modern design trends ends up hampering it as an aesthetic experience. As one might expect, combat is the most common form of gameplay you're going to get in either title. They are superheroes after all, it's sort of what they do. Some costume bad guy shows up and gets his shit kicked in, all for the price of a couple nickels. The specifics, however, shed light on some serious discrepancies between design philosophies of both the Arkham titles and Spider-Man. Ones which underline their attitude towards their subject matter, which in turn alters the perception of how they feel to play. Batman gameplay consists of multiple constituent parts which, when put together, create the Batman experience, which the game strives to achieve. While Spider-Man's gameplay includes only a small sampling of that same achievement and replaces it with a more watered-down experience emblematic of a modern design philosophy. Now, to be fair, Arkham gameplay isn't the most difficult to play, even on their hardest difficulties. They are, however, extremely varied and responsive. Combat consists of beating the hell out of criminals who invariably outnumber you, trying to crowd around the Dark Knight and overwhelm him. Batman, for his part, though, is extremely agile, as well as being shockingly violent. Gameplay encourages a consistency on the part of the player, avoiding damage as much as possible and trying to get their combo meter as high as possible. Similar to other action games, your score is the main driver of skill expression. If you really wanted to, you could just counter every attack and not actually engage with the rest of your arsenal, but where's the fun in that? Not to mention that the bonus challenge rooms and combat encounters actually are reliant on your score, meaning that gameplay is focused around wanting you to not just beat your enemies, but dominate them, just like Batman. On the flip side, stealth gameplay embodies the other skill set the game wants the player to undertake, as Batman is also a powerfully talented, sneaky guy. Enemies with guns are dangerous since obviously, Batman can't shoot back, and so instead you need to separate them within large rooms using a combination of gadgets and navigation. As the guards begin to panic, the more of them you take out. This is all to say that the gameplay is centered solely around recreating the feeling of being Batman, of being a cool dude, through allowing the player to embody the exact skills they know the Caped Crusader already has. Spider-Man certainly tries to do the same, most obviously in its infatuation with Spider-Man's ability to web-sling through the streets of New York. Now, to its credit, this form of navigation is very good. And while I'll personally always prefer the original Spider-Man 2's rendition, if for no other reason than nostalgia, it is here that Insomniac's dedication to the feeling of such elegant traversal is most effective. What is less effective is its own takes on combat and stealth. Combat in Spider-Man is by design much more floaty, which is saying something since you could say the same thing about the Arkham games, and here it seems to dominate the majority of your playtime. One of the reasons that's the case is the physics of combat, in the sense that it plays much more like a video game. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but if the goal is to recreate the feeling of being Spider-Man, adhering to some basis of reality to juxtapose Parker's abilities with the average criminal, or super criminal I guess, would be ideal. Instead, the game includes things like air combos, leaning even more into that action game feeling. There are also some actual problems, namely that Spidey's mobility is often too effective. Remember that whole air combo thing? Well, you'll actually spend a lot of time in the air if you're fairly competent, which deflates the tension of combat since most guys aren't going to be able to hit you all the way up there. Your skills are only impressive if there's some actual threat towards you. In the Arkham games, all it takes is one slip-up, either by getting hit or just missing an attack, to set your combo back to 0, which is when you're at your most vulnerable. Batman's foes are also way more aggressive and use different weapons that can't be circumvented with the same ease that Spider-Man has thanks to his web-slinging. Armed foes in Arkham have unique attacks that need a particular move to defeat. Shields need to be stunned and vaulted. Knives need to be dodged consistently and in quick succession. Foes with stun batons can't be attacked at all, and once combat starts including firearms, you need to kick your aggressiveness into overdrive. using your disarm move to destroy their weapons at the cost of losing out on being able to instantly knock someone down. Spider-Man circumvents all this by staying mostly in the air, and it doesn't help that just in general, the AI is far less aggressive. There's fewer opponents than there are in Arkham, and while they do have weapons, they're again dumbed down mostly just by being another attack type you can air dodge. Stealth gameplay suffers even more from Spider-Man's immense speed. You can run through most challenges comfortably with little risk to yourself, while Batman has to plan ahead to take out his foes. Ironically, Spider-Man's stealth feels similar to the variety found in Shadow of Mordor, which was made by the guys who did the Arkham games, the only difference being that Parker can do way more stuff without needing to be as subtle as the guy from Mordor, because, he's not gonna get swarmed by orcs. The gameplay differences are at their most obvious when it comes to boss fights, which lay bare the underlying disconnect that Spider-Man has from its source material. Arkham boss fights are varied and unique, embodying more of the character of the villain in question rather than just being a smackdown between you and them. Spider-Man struggles with this more, although the second game does better with more set-piece fights that are visually quite entertaining. They're not the opening of God of War 3 or anything, but they're cool in their own way. Other fights, though, are just, fights without any visual or mechanical flair. Batman has some of those too, don't get me wrong, but so many others seek to break the mold. The Penguin doesn't fight you himself, he sicks Solomon Grundy on you, forcing you to cartwheel around destroying the mechanism which gives him life. Ra's al Ghul turns into a big sand demon fella, and he has shadow clone jutsu. The Mr. Freeze fight is a stealth encounter about using every gadget you have in your arsenal. Deathstroke's gimmick is that he actually just fights you like a cool dude. Poison Ivy has that stupid plant monster. Clayface is a giant clay guy. And the Riddler doesn't even fight you, except in Arkham Knight, but we're not talking about that one, because, he's the Riddler. Spider-Man's wasted potential hurts sometimes, because it's hard not to see it just blur into the rest of the modern AAA action scene, just with really good traversal. Instead, it seems to focus only on recreating the typical action game stylings, as well as capturing the same modern visual aesthetic of AAA titles.
Yeah! That I love. I absolutely love.
Visually, the games once again diverge, as a result of their original creators having different intentions for setting and tone. DC Comics were happy to parody real-life locations to give them more campy feeling, while allowing for more aesthetic flourishes. Marvel, though, insists on setting their heroes in the real world. I certainly wouldn't say that one is outright superior to the other, that really does come down to taste, but what I can say is that one very clearly opens itself up to creativity more than the other. The Arkham games leaned fully into this, taking advantage of the fact that Gotham City isn't a real place, but instead is a much more focused, developed locale with decades of comic continuity to draw from. Their best choice, though, was to take cues from the animated series. The animated series probably did the most for Gotham in recreating the style of a dark, pseudo-noir city, which was simultaneously modern yet antiquated. The city is cosmopolitan, but grimy, lively yet lonesome. It didn't shy away from its original mid-20th century roots. If anything, it embraced them. The Arkham games, City in particular, aims to recreate this to a T, including things like the nonsensical police blimps or the Wonder Tower, the forgotten buried city beneath. Its buildings are suitably dilapidated, where once Gotham could have been this shining beacon of industry and advancement, it now literally sinks into the mire of its own corruption. Gotham, then, is both real and fake, favoring its unique aesthetic to more accurately recreate the feeling of the car. I can't get to a fucking single sentence. I can't get through a sentence. I'm going crazy. I need a drink. Some cool pop. Son of a bitch. Gotham, then, is both real and fake, favoring its unique aesthetic to more accurately recreate the feeling of the comics and the animated series. And it does so much to its advantage, because Gotham City is at its best when it's trying not to be realistic. Its thematic fall from grace being a mirror for the modern era of crime which rocks the urban center, and which Batman must fight against, metaphorically and literally. Spider-Man takes place in New York, the real city, which is part of the Marvel insistence of being intricately linked to the real world. There's nothing wrong with that in principle, but when it's taken as part of the gaming industry as a whole, it's not exactly that compelling. You could make New York interesting by combining its realism with a variety of interesting characters, unexpected locales, and the like, but instead, Spider-Man attempts to make the most idyllic and ironically unrealistic depiction of New York that they can. It's the most pleasant city in the world, even though that's not actually true in reality, with every street and building being pristine or diverse or whatever buzzword they want to use to justify their design, and it ends up making New York blend together with every other city you've seen in a game before. It's New York again, hooray! It's got the places you'd expect, but doesn't really go above and beyond that. This applies to character and enemy designs as well. Generic hired goons or paramilitaries dominate the Spider-Man games as they just sort of commit crimes of varying degrees of inconvenience. Or maybe they're just a generic cult. It's really not that interesting. Batman enemies could be generic too, but often they were given visual flares and voice lines to make them more interesting. Penguin's goons don't look like the Jokers, who don't look like Two-Faces. The League of Assassins fight totally different from your run-of-the-mill street criminal. To top it all off, the bad guys are just kind of funny. They're all idiots, which makes it more cathartic when you clown on them. This is most evident in stealth gameplay, where the guards become more aware of your presence, and their dwindling numbers, they start to panic, and their actions become more erratic. This applies to Batman's take on his rogue gallery as well, where their designs stay mostly within the bounds of their most iconic looks, while still trying for different changes.
There's nothing wrong with you.
Nice of you to say, but you of all people should know there's plenty wrong with me.
I always liked that the Penguin's monocle was turned into this glass bottle thing shoved right into his eye. Makes him look more intimidating than previous incarnations. Another advantage that the Batman villains have, though, is their usage in the series' narratives. Superhero narratives tend to be fairly formulaic, generally speaking. The hero has to stop a big bad guy from doing a thing, usually involving an evil plan that will cause untold destruction on a scale relevant to the scale of the story. There might be some co-villains doing their own thing along the way, but eventually the hero or heroes do a thing, and the day is saved. And there was much rejoicing. The trick then is to create a story that is varied by using a reasonable selection of villains and locales while still maintaining a solid overarching plot. Batman did this best, once again, in Arkham City, where the inclusion of his villains are sprinkled about in such a way that their inclusion makes sense as part of the world, and less so because of the story demanding it. Some villains are obvious. The Joker, for instance, is going to show up because of course he is. And Asylum made Riddler into this side villain whose impact is focused on the game's free roam aspects rather than linear progression, so he's gonna do that too. Others show up just for fun cameos, playing to the idea of Gotham City as a setting, and once again bolstering the feeling of really being the bad. Because, look, that guy, there he is, I know that guy, that's the bad guy I beat up. But even in Arkham City, there are plenty of surprise appearances. The main villain isn't actually Joker, it's Hugo Strange. Joker is just there to complicate things. Origins include a small posse of foes all out for Batman's head, while still including other threats that measured up to the story's more laid-back stakes. For Spider-Man, though, they can't help but tip their hand. The black spider suit is in there, so instantly you know the final bad guy is probably gonna be Venom, or some kind of symbiote. But instead they pretend like Kraven is actually the big deal opponent. And this isn't the fault of the villains themselves, they're fine on their own. But it's the structure which leads you to them that feels so forced, so gamey. And not forced in the silly way. Comic book stories are going to be a little forced, but I mean it in the sense that each encounter seems like a now we have to go and stop this guy affair, rather than coolly transitioning to each one. It's a feeling that's difficult to shake for a lot of games, and it's often tied to the entire game as a whole, rather than just one particular decision. It culminates in one thing, how it feels to play the game.
Yeah! This is a complete turnoff! It's incredibly misleading!
I think the best way to sum up the difference between these two series is very simple. They say the thing they're supposed to say.
I'm an instrument whose music always comes from the heart. What am I?
Batman Arkham contains the hallmarks of everything the entirety of Batman canon has created up to each game's release, within reason. From its characters, its style, the comic book camp, the melodrama, the actors, the endless insistence upon cramming more into these games already backed up with content. It gets excited to put characters in for the sake of it, which again brings us back to the Riddler. Anything they couldn't substantially include in the games is addressed by him, usually in the form of a riddle. Shocking, I know. It's the developers telling you that they don't just know about the world of Gotham City, they know you want someone to acknowledge that it exists even if they can't implement it fully. These games are complete renditions of the Batman experience, intended solely to entertain both fans of the comics, the shows, the films, and games. All of them will get exactly what they want. Spider-Man simply isn't like that. It's designed first and foremost like a game. It's structured to build up each encounter like levels, but that's not what the actual experience of being Spider-Man would be like. Spider-Man has all sorts of friends and foes he interacts with, both in his own canon as well as the larger Marvel universe. And that's ironic because you'd think they'd be leaning into the whole expanded universe crap, but thankfully they don't. That would require more effort outside of setting up every encounter as linearly as possible. The Arkham games always valued that comic book feeling more than anything else. That it was taking place in a proper comic continuity with all the characters and villains having their own prominent role. There was a main bad guy most of the time, yes, but that didn't detract from the rest of the gallery. Characters like Mr. Freeze and the Riddler show just how impactful a more hands-off approach can be, where their inclusion is meant to facilitate their own stories alongside the main narrative. It helps too that they're so set on selling you these villains as strongly as possible. They're not undercut by each other, or worse, undercut by a Marvel-esque one-liner like in Spider-Man. The satisfaction of defeating them comes from defeating them, and not just having Batman say, "I got you." There are plenty of iterations where Spider-Man isn't a quippy mess. It's instead a little more serious or understated, and that likely would have worked better for a more serious narrative, like the ones these games try to have. Something similar to the Sam Raimi films might have worked to balance Parker's more humoristic undertones. He could joke around, sure, but when he needed to get serious, he could fall back into a much more reserved, even angry version of himself when it was pertinent. Giving Spider-Man a wider range of traits to go between would help differentiate himself from his film counterparts, as well as juxtapose with the fairly grim Caped Crusader. But unfortunately, that sort of subtlety simply isn't the trend anymore.
You guys not have phones? Yeah, you guys all have phones, right?
Insomniac's Spider-Man games suffer from a very difficult to describe problem, one that's hard to diagnose because it's so nebulous and variable. These games are modern action titles, and I need to explain what that is. If I showed you a modern action title, you'd see a game that's functionally quite decent, but in terms of any unique elements of their design, like attention to detail, immersion, subtlety, diegetic story or gameplay, control, nuance, visual variety, and plenty of other things, they simply aren't present. Go play one of these Spider-Man games and then play something like Jedi Survivor and you'll see what I mean. The gameplay is acceptable, sure, but it isn't doing anything really that interesting, is it? Is it communicating something other than basic sensory data? Usually not. In the Arkham games, the small nuances of your actions dictate just how much you're going to feel like Batman. And it's not just that Batman beats the bad guys up, it's that he savagely beats the hell out of them. His strikes maim his opponents, breaking bones and dislocating limbs. Guards' heart rates skyrocket as they become cornered. The villains always think they have the upper hand until Bruce takes them down with a well-placed gadget or a kick. The world is dark and somber, but not grim. There's still good people in Gotham, the people Batman is trying to protect, even if he's doing it as violently as he does. But what's most important? It's strikingly somber. One of the most memorable scenes in the series is visiting Crime Alley in Arkham City. It's a location that's not actually marked out for you to find. Instead, it's simply a part of the city you might recognize. For those unaware, Crime Alley, funny name I know, is the same alley Bruce's parents were killed in. And if you go there, you'll find a little surprise left by Hugo Strange.
How does it feel, Wayne, to stand on the very stones that ran with your parents' blood? Do you feel sad? Full of rage? Or does that outfit help bury your feelings, hiding your true self?
This scene is shocking to me, if for no other reason than it came out on the 360 and PS3, which was, not a time where games were subtle like this. It lets you stop fighting the criminals, the villains, the psychos, and instead encourages you to take on the role of Batman in a different way. Instead of a crime fighter, you're a grieving son. You could stay there as long as you want, watching Bruce take a moment to mourn for his family, but this moment can't last forever. Just like Bruce, you know that at some point you have to stop and get back to what you're trying to do. It's those corpses in the alley that got him, and by extension you, the player, into that suit. And now you have to embody that mask even stronger. Spider-Man doesn't have time for these quieter moments unless they're compulsory in the plot. It's a symptom of modern Marvel writing and game design, where being slow is seen as being boring, but obviously that's not the case. Sometimes you really do need to just take a second, not in a cutscene, mind you, but in the game itself. You're not fighting hard, You're not traversing hard. You're not even in the mindset of beating the game. You're in the mindset of experiencing it. And what's strange is that there were Spider-Man games before the modern titles which did hit upon all these ideas before. I mentioned Spider-Man 2 on the GameCube. It focused heavily on the smaller aspects of Peter's life alongside the big encounters with his villains. At least by GameCube standards, you were often encouraged to do smaller tasks rather than engaging with the main story, and when you did, they made sure to turn those story events into unique gameplay experiences. What about the original Spider-Verse game? Remember that? It predates the films by several years. It was about taking advantage of Spider-Man's various aesthetics and turning them into a unique take on a beloved character. There was moody stealth as a noir Spider-Man, classic bad guys as normal Peter Parker, that future Spider-Man guy who I don't know his name, he shows up. They pulled in all sorts of villains from over the years to have some fights with, in the same vein of the Arkham games, only it was a lot more linear. And for the record, the latest Arkham titles do suffer from similar problems, which again lends credence to it being a problem of modern design philosophies, and not because I like Batman more than Spider-Man. Don't even try to say that. I've preempted you, you lose! There's a lot of things to learn from both these series, which are worth mentioning, but the biggest takeaway, like every other one of these comparisons I've made, is the feeling. How does it feel to play? Do the games really have the effort put into them to make you feel like they're heroes? Both have some effort, for sure, but I think the Arkham games always strive for it more than others. They were, for their time, very big releases, not unlike Insomniac's games. But for the latter, their games get fanfare for other reasons, mostly the kind you get from talking points on Twitter, and the fact that the PS5 has no games, so what the hell else are you gonna play? It gets its fanfare because there's no competition, and because it imitates the modern trends enough to eke out enough of a reception that people will take note of it, not because it truly excels at what it's trying to accomplish. And that's a real shame, because they'll never get any better if they don't have an impetus for change. They'll only ever be able to say, we made our money back, this time, and not, we made a game people still love today. Mark my words, these Spider-Man games will lose their admirers real quick, if, again, only because people on Twitter don't actually play games and will lose interest. Insomniac's work will congeal into the ever-expanding blob of 3D action titles that you can't even name any of them anymore because you've already forgotten. With great power comes great responsibility, and the responsibility to bring to life such evocative characters has fallen into the hands of those who may never be able to wield it properly. But I say you have to have a little bit of faith. Shitty games are temporary, but good ones are forever. No one ever said it'd be easy, but maybe someone who can take up that mantle is just around the corner. Who knows? It could even be you. Nah, just kidding. We're doomed.
What a sorry state we're in.